So my job is to both participate in and to introduce our first plenary panel, which, as Maggie indicated, it was really designed initially to be a little bit about the past. You know, how did we originate? What were the goals of this conference? But I suspect that many, if not most of us, are going to be talking a good deal more about our thoughts on the future. So my three fellow co-panelists actually do not need any introduction to this group. Seated in this order, Peter Yu, Mark Lemley, Graeme, Dinwoodie. And we will be speaking in the order that we're in, so I'm going to begin our plenary session. I think it's worthwhile at this juncture just to tell the story of IPSC. Our Dean Perea actually mentioned already how small IPSC was in that very first year. But because collective memory is something that I highly value, both personally and professionally, I'm just going to fill in the nuance just a little bit. So one of the early initiatives that I did have when I founded CIPLET was to create a space for scholars, IP scholars, to take their works that they had honed over the summer and to create a safe, nurturing space for us to present our works before taking them out on the road where the environment may not be as safe and friendly and nurturing. And that was really my initial idea with IPSC. Since we didn't have money to spend, or I wasn't comfortable asking my dean at the time for money, we were a fledgling center, it was very important to keep everything economic. And so therefore, the people that we invited were all local that year. Everybody came from schools in Chicago, with just a couple of exceptions. Now, because I really do believe that there's strength in numbers, one of the first things I did after I thought about this idea was I called Marcy Hamilton. Marcy and I, 15 years ago, spent a lot of time in the same circles. I so admired what Marcy did. Thank you, Maggie. I so admired what Marcy did at Cardozo and how she was building that program. That was a blueprint for me, actually, with here at DePaul. And so I called Marcy and I said, what do you think of this idea? Would you like to partner? And she referred me to Peter, who was at the time the executive director of Cardozo's program, and Peter thought it was a great idea. So we planned that program. We held it at the Rare Book Room downstairs here at the law school, and there were very few attendees. Now, we did fly one person in because I wanted to give it a little bit of a imprimatur, right? And so the person I invited in, and I'm so excited, this is the most exciting part of my talk from my perspective. I'm excited to share with you why that person isn't here today. The person is Wendy Gordon. Wendy, as we all know, is a phenomenal scholar. The reason she is not here, she was invited, but Wendy's getting married this week to her longtime beau, Michael Zimmer. So I'm so excited for Wendy. It's much better that she's getting married than being here, but she was the only person who actually flew in for the conference. All right, and then Peter, of course, came from Cardozo. During this time, Mark Lemley happened to be in town. It was the ABA conference, which is always at this time of the year. Mark came, he asked if he could come, he said, of course. And then at the end, Mark was so excited about what he saw. He said, you know, would it be okay if Berkeley was a co-sponsor? And Peter and I looked at each other in a millisecond. We said, well, of course. And so Mark went back and he talked to Peter Manel and he talked to Pam Samuelson. They came on board. And then some years later, Mark went over to Stanford, and that's how the four of us, the four institutions, were paired together. And that is the story of the IPSC. Okay, so that is about the past. But I want to really focus on some of the present realities that Dean Perea alluded to. We are in a very, very different world now than we were 15 years ago. When I started CIPLET at DePaul, my vision was that everything was possible. Even non-elite schools could have a dream that they could move up the rankings, and many scholars in many schools believed that they had a chance of also moving up to perhaps more prestigious places. These dreams are simply not as realistic today as they once were. So I want to talk about these changes and the impact that these changes have on our scholarship, on our research agenda, and on the venues that showcase scholarship, such as IPSC. So, what are these realities? Well, as we know, money is very tight. And yes, it is true. Josh Sarnoff and Maggie Livingston raised the lion's share of the money so that we could put this conference on. But the kinds of realities that are going on that impact scholarship are going to force all of us, everybody sitting in this room and everybody in the Legal Academy, to think very carefully about how do we preserve personal space for scholarly endeavors? How do we preserve personal space for our scholarly endeavors? So what are these realities? Okay, well, we know that money is very tight, but what does this mean? You know, at many schools, summer research stipends are either being slashed or they're being completely eliminated. Secondly, money for research assistants, the students that we used to be able to pay to help us with our research, is in many institutions being eliminated. Thirdly, our teaching loads are changing. Not only are many of us being asked to teach more courses, but it's not just a numerical increase. Because of the inability for many schools to hire, we are also being asked to teach in more areas, and many of us in areas other than just IP. That affects, again, the time and ability we have to do our own scholarship because we're busy teaching more classes in a greater variety of fields. And finally, money is drying up for travel. Our travel budgets are drying up, which means that we can't attend as many conferences as we want. And schools have less money to invite speakers in. All of these are changing the realities. Now, I also believe that many schools are beginning, as Dean Jen mentioned, to question the very wisdom of scholarship. I think it is likely in the future that more and more law schools are going to move to a model of corporate management type of model. And the real question, or what will really be valued in the future, is revenue generation. How can faculty and others generate revenue for our institution? And this is going to impact how faculty and their quote-unquote productivity are going to be evaluated in future years. I think law schools will increasingly question how the precious dollars that they do have are being spent and whether providing support and venues for scholarship is the best use of these precious dollars. The old narrative that great faculty scholars will enhance the prestige of our faculty is going to, I think, become a distant memory at many, if not most law schools, but for the very top of the top. And like those academic rankings that we all look at in US News, I've studied those rankings in the past. They're the hardest to move, even in the good days. Those were very, very hard to move. So it's not surprising to me at this point in time that law schools are going to seek a bigger bang for their increasingly diminishing buck, and maybe to try to move their support into other areas. So what should be our response as law professors? Well, some of us may not have the choice. With the diminishment of summer research grants and stipends and travel money, some professors may need to work in other ways to supplement their income, such as practicing law on the side or consulting. And in fact, schools may actually prefer that choice because what most of us hear about these days is the need to make our students practice ready. Okay, that's another topic for discussion. But I think there'll be many of us that will nonetheless forge ahead and will really want to continue to do what most of us entered the Legal Academy to do, and that is to write. So then the question is, how do we go about this, and what should we be contemplating as we think about these new realities? So this summer, I read a law review article that was one of the most compelling and provocative articles I have ever read. It was authored by a law professor at University of Richmond named Sherry Motro. The piece was entitled Scholarship Against Desire, and it was published in the Yale Journal of Law and Humanities. Now, Sherry Motro, her article was about authenticity in legal scholarship, but she clothed that narrative about authenticity in a narrative of, now I'm going to get your attention, sex against desire. Okay, so Sherry Motro writes in the area, a lot of her pieces have to do with consensual but unwanted sex. And she talked about her pre-tenure track, and she's placed her pieces very, very successfully, Stanford and Northwestern, but she really talked about what her writing looked like pre-tenure and what it would have looked like had she really done what she wanted to do. I'm just going to read you 4 quick sentences from her article, because I can't do it justice in this talk, but I urge all of you to read it. I quote, "Because like intimate partners who agree to sex they don't truly desire, professors who adhere to conventions that don't serve their deepest relationship with truth engage in a compromise that ultimately hurts not only them. It hurts students by breeding cynicism and causing depression. It hurts the practice of law by producing foot soldiers instead of visionary stewards. Ultimately, it's a compromise that hurts all of society. So Sherry Motro's article really resonated with me because about 10 years or so ago, I actually decided I was going to write what was most personally meaningful to me, regardless of where it might place. And that required a shift in focus. And Sherry Motro talks about this in her piece because whenever you shift gears, you're starting over, you're becoming vulnerable, and that's scary, right, for all of us that care about our reputation. And she talks about the need to sort of start over in this way as a way to really approach an authenticity of scholarship. Now, as IP scholars, we love to talk about authenticity. We talk about it in all forms, one way or another. And Motro alleges in her piece, and I agree with her, that if we were to have a greater degree of authenticity in our legal scholarship, that would benefit not just ourselves, but it would benefit students because it would role model for students how they can align their professional identities with their personal sensibilities of who we are. And I think that's really something that we all really need to take seriously and to think about. So I thank Maggie, by the way, for mentioning my new book, which I spent 7 years on, and I want to sort of like address the question of, to me, what does it mean to do authentic legal scholarship? Because it's something, the question of authenticity is a question that I've been asking in one form or another in my writings for 30 years, right? If you're talking about moral rights, you're talking about authenticity. If you're talking about Jewish tradition, you're talking about authenticity. But to me, authenticity in legal scholarship essentially means a couple of things that I think we need to take more seriously in our academic discourse. So the first is, to me, authenticity does not mean shooting from the hip, okay? To me, producing authentic legal scholarship means that you take your time to lay the groundwork and really know your field. So in this day and age, we can use those current realities in which the external carrots are becoming fewer and fewer to really take our research agendas and craft them and do the groundwork we need to do to produce the kind of scholarship that we could consider really authentic. For some of us, it may mean, if you write in interdisciplinary fields, if you haven't gotten an advanced degree before entering the academy, it may mean getting an advanced degree in order to gain the knowledge, the breadth of knowledge that you need. It means having the luxury. We now have the luxury to take our time to produce the work that our best work, our most authentic work, because we're not going to be judged, I don't think, in the future on the quantity and the perceived quality of our work, I think, of our scholarly work. I think that's going to be the trend of the future. So this is one way we can really think about what our research agenda should be. The second aspect of authenticity in legal scholarship that I would want to mention is something that we really don't talk about as often as I think we should. And this aspect has to do with whether we're doing scholarship or we're doing advocacy. I think all too often scholarship devolves into advocacy. And I don't necessarily think that is the best or the most authentic way to think about it. To me, authenticity in scholarship means you don't know where you're going to come out before you actually do the work. You may have an idea, but you've got to take an objective, open-minded look at whatever you're working on. To me, that type of approach produces the most authentic scholarship that we're capable of. So finally, in conclusion, what does this mean for IPSC? I believe that IPSC and other venues that showcase scholarship, I would like to see us pay more attention to the process of how to produce scholarship that falls into this category of authentic legal scholarship that Sherry Motro talks about and that I've elaborated on today. Can we find ways to tweak IPSC so that it really continues to keep the original vision, which was to have a safe, nurturing place for all of us to share our ideas. In Motro's article, she says that we need to find generally ways of showcasing scholarship where ego is suspended and where people listening to each other without dissecting, judging, or planning a response, in which people speak without grasping for approval. Motro says in her piece that when this happens, the wisdom of the group goes up a notch. I actually agree with her and think that that's very, very well said. So I'd like to close by saying that, in my view, the key to longevity in the legal profession is the ability to reinvent oneself. The Madonna phenomenon, if you will, right? And I think this is true not just for academics, but I think it's true for venues that showcase scholarship. So I'm excited to hear what my co-panelists and what people tomorrow are going to say and to start the conversations of how we can take IPSC and continue to make it relevant as we move forward in legal education. Thank you.
So I think I'll speak from here. So I'm basically the baby of this group, and so I'm not going to be able to follow Bobby in terms of giving you the research agenda or talking about what you should do. But talking about collective memory, it's just a pleasure to be back here. For those of you who do not know Marcy Hamilton, she has done very interesting work in terms of IP and also First Amendment, and now she's focusing mostly on church and state issues. She's basically my mentor, and so when Bobby contacted us, I was talking to her about what we should do, and there are two things that immediately come to mind at that time. And the first one is that at that time, a lot of schools are not bringing in a lot of IP scholars to do faculty talks, right? If you're Mark Lemley, obviously you'll get to do a talk, but if you are at other schools, you don't get a chance to go to do faculty scholarship and to do faculty talks. And so we are thinking whether we can provide forum for a lot of the junior scholars to be able to do something like that. And one model that's very attractive at that time is, I think Yale and Stanford just started a junior faculty workshop, and that was done the year before. And we thought that, well, it would be a great idea if we're doing something similar, but in the IP field. And at that time, a lot of schools are putting together speaker series with different faculty members coming to present IP works, especially for those schools with large IP programs, so like DePaul, Cardozo, Santa Clara, some of the schools. And so we thought that, well, if we actually do it on 2 days, we can bring together different talks similar to a speaker series, except that everything will be on 2 days. And so we can have everybody together. So we thought it would be a good idea to do it this way. The other thing that have been going through our mind is that a lot of the major law schools are starting to have IP programs. And so in order for Cardozo, DePaul, and a lot of schools trying to stay with what they're doing in the IP area, it's very important for us to look for other things that we can do. And one way to do it is basically to bring the different programs together. And so our original plan is to have DePaul, Cardozo, and then another school on the West Coast trying to do it together. And so we are very excited when Mark came to the conference and offered to join us, and I think it would just be wonderful. I don't think at that time we actually believed that we'll be able to get Berkeley or eventually Stanford to actually join us as collaborators. And so, but it works out very well because you have one school on the East Coast, one school in the Midwest, and then one school on the West Coast, and now 2 schools on the West Coast. And so basically that's how we set it up. Looking around the room, I think other than the 4 of us, Ann Bartle is the original presenter. She was there right there. And I think that's also how I met Kathy right there in the conference. So IPSC is a very good way to actually meet people. So what I want to end on with the second half of my remarks here is basically talk about these type of conferences, because I get a lot of those questions from people about where they should go to those conferences and how it's useful. I think it's very important for you to actually find out what is the origin of the conference or who are the organizers. Different institutions, different people organize conferences different, and you get different feedback or different type of arrangement. Law Society is a very good example. These days, a lot of us will go to Law Society. You usually find maybe 10 panels, maybe more, depending on whether it's in Hawaii. But if when we first went there, we do not have a lot of people there going into our IP sessions. And so I remember there's one panel we organized at 8:30 in the morning. And so it's early in the morning. I think Mike Madison is there, Ann Bartle is there, and then we're trying to figure out whether we should wait or not, because there are only 2 people in the audience. We basically get more panelists than the audience. So we've decided to wait, and then one left. And so we realized that, well, that's not a very good way for us to actually get together to talk about scholarship. And so we've decided to have the mini conference within Law Society. And that's why now you basically see about 5 panels, 10 panels all together within the conference. And so the more you understand why we set up this way, the more likely you find it that will be useful. The second thing I think that will be quite useful is to think about what type of things will be useful when you go to a conference, right? Do you want to meet with some of the mentors? Do you want to talk to people about collaboration? And for me, I usually try to talk to some international speakers because of my research, right? So I would target conferences that would be helpful to me in terms of my research. Some conferences will be more like speed dating, right? You just go there to present for about 10 to 15 minutes, whereas our conferences will give you about 30 minutes, so you can do a presentation, and then you also have Q&A time. And some formats work better for some people, and some formats do not work as well for others. And the final thing I would end on is that if you happen to have a very generous dean to give you money to your conference, the last thing I would advise you to do is to do a work in progress conference. I think a lot of people don't realize how much it costs to do it. You think that, well, it's just work in progress, we have everybody flying in on their own, and then they will take care of the hotel expenses and other things, so it's actually not expensive. When you look at this room, this conference is, I would say, from 15 to 30,000 easily, right? In terms of the meals, in terms of all the other things, and you go out to bring in the co-sponsors, and you can do it in a smaller scale. But the challenge, I think, for a lot of IP programs is that work in progress conferences now have a lot of features, right? People are doing game truck, doing karaoke night, doing all the other things to attract people just to go to those conferences. So if you're going to set up a conference and you happen to have dean giving you 5,000 or 10,000, you're actually much better off doing a symposium or have a theme-based conference. One of the things I miss the most in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years is that most program directors and most professors are no longer doing those theme-based conferences with a lot of views. And so you end up having a lot of work in progress conferences where people are just presenting all different things. And so I strongly encourage those who happen to have a very generous dean or when the economy is getting better with the law schools, consider to actually have theme-based conferences. I think that's actually more productive that way. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
All right. So as Josh Sarnoff explained this panel structure, here at the opening session we have the old folks talking about the good old days and the way things were, and then you'll conclude the conference with the next generation talking about the future. I still want to know how Pam Samuelson managed to get herself on the future conference, but I'm very impressed. Exactly, I'm jealous. So, you know, and look, you've heard the history of IP scholars, and I'm not going to repeat it. What I want to focus a little bit on is what I see that's changed in the IP scholarly community in the 15 years we've been doing this. The first thing, obviously, is size. So as Bobby says, there were 9 people at the first one. That doesn't mean there were 9 people in all of intellectual property law, but there were a lot fewer people in intellectual property law than there are today. And I think in virtually all respects, that's been a good thing, right? Building a community of size has allowed us to explore new avenues. It's allowed us to have much more discussion about a wide variety of things. We've also seen a rather dramatic expansion in subject matter. When I started teaching 21 years ago, IP and copyright were not entirely coextensive, but they were pretty darn close. Dan Burke and I sat down at one point and figured out that there were 5 people in the country who had been teaching patent law longer than we had. It just wasn't something you did a generation before. There were exceptions. Marty Edelman is here, but there were very few of them. And what we've seen is a dramatic expansion sort of laterally that's gone along with the expansion in size, and that too I think is a good thing. Right, the ability to sort of actually have a whole cadre of people digging into patent law, digging into trademark law, digging in increasingly to areas like trade secret and design, which we hadn't focused on even very much 5 or 10 years ago, I think is a really good thing. We've also seen expansion in a third dimension, and that's methodology. And in particular, I think there are a variety of different methodologies we see employed, but I want to call out the growth of empirical work. George Priest wrote an article back in 1986 called What Economists Can Tell Lawyers About Intellectual Property, and his conclusion was nothing, because we haven't actually studied and we haven't got any data, we haven't got any evidence. The conclusion may still turn out to be nothing, but it's for a very different reason. It's not that we don't have evidence, we actually have an enormous array of evidence by people, many of whom are in this room, doing really good work to figure out what's going on in the world. The upshot of it may well be it's complicated, right? It doesn't actually tell you need strong IP, you need weak IP, you need no IP. It may tell you that you need different things in different circumstances, but figuring that out is something I think that the scholarly community has done really just in the last 15 or 20 years, and that's something that's really important. The next way in which I think things have changed fairly dramatically in the time I've been teaching is the relevance of our work to the world. And in part that's a function of the growing relevance of intellectual property to the world. The idea that patents would show up on The Daily Show or last week tonight, the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, right, was ludicrous 20 years ago. But they have in fact become a sort of part of the fabric of society, and I think our scholarship, in turn, has become more and more important to the cases and legislative work that's been decided, and that's a really good thing. I think it's a function of the fact that we are actually providing evidence and not just supposition more and more, but it's also a function of the fact that people are writing scholarship not simply for other scholars, but for its impact in the world, right? In order to have in order to make the world a better place. Now, I think that is a good thing, but with it come two things that may not be so good. One of the things that I have seen in the 20 years, and really just in the last several years in some fields, is the increasing divide of the IP scholarly community into more and more polarized camps. There was always a little bit of this in the copyright world, certainly among lawyers, but I think less among scholars. You see more of it among scholars, and you see it in patent law as well, right? You see the development of the sort of high protectionist group running high protectionist conferences, and the low protectionist group running low protectionist conferences, and people talking to each other less and less, paying less attention to the ideas from the other side. And I think that's a worrisome thing. It may be that it's a function of the development of the real world importance of what we're doing, right? That people are looking for answers that support one position or another, and they're pushing increasingly towards ideological scholarship rather than neutral scholarship. But the introduction of politics in the IP scholarly community, I think, is a somewhat worrying trend. The other somewhat worrying trend is the growing role of money. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. Bobby talks about the resource constraints and the fact that, as Peter says, it's expensive to run a conference like this, and so we need to reach out and get support. But it's also a function of the real-world relevance and the politics, right? There are people out there who would like to spend lots of money in some cases if they can get the answer they want. And I worry that increasingly that connection is becoming more and more clear, right? And it's not simply, here's some money because, boy, it seems like a good idea to advance knowledge, but here's some money if you can demonstrate that patent holdup isn't a problem in the telecommunications industry. Right, here's some money if you can demonstrate that authors are really suffering as a result of the internet and we need to do something about it. Or, to be fair, right, the other side. This is not a kind of, one side or the other problem. There's lots of money sloshing around, and the combination of those two things, politics and money, is not good. It's not good in society at large. It's not good in the IP scholarly community either. If you read the Oatmeal, the Oatmeal has an analysis of internet plus anonymity. Internet plus anonymity, the Oatmeal says, leads to fucktards. Politics and money are kind of like internet and anonymity. It can mess things up in a really major way. Now, I think there are things we can do about it. I think the IP scholarly community has a long history of cohesiveness, of working together, of sharing ideas, reading people's drafts, and talking to each other. That history, frankly, is something that makes us the envy of most other scholarly communities. Having conferences like this, having a community that comes together, I think, is something that's really important. And it's something we need to continue. Robin Feldman and others, including me, are working on a sort of statement of principles or guidance for thinking about funding and scholarship and the way in which we should be taking or not taking money and taking or not taking conditions on that money. So I think the IP scholarly community is great. The developments I've seen have mostly been positive, but there are some worrying things. I really don't want us to become a sort of polarized community where who funds your work, whether because it starts with your pre-existing bias or not, right, ends up kind of driving what your work actually does. This is the old folks panel, so in conclusion and on that note, you kids get off my lawn.
Thanks, Josh and Bobby, for the invitation to speak. Josh suggested we do a little bit of retrospective and a little bit looking forward. So let me start on the retrospective. My most vivid memory of the IPSC, which makes it very, very different from this year's, is the physics of space. We were actually in a rare book room in the library, but despite that, what I remember, other than the fact that we had 2 or 3 seats to the table, each of us, as we sat there, was that the table, which was the focus of everything, became a rather unsettling accumulation of half-eaten food and consumed soft drinks and marked up notes on draft articles over the case. It sort of reflected, it was the detritus of hard scholarly debate in a collegial fashion. And that's actually the most physical thing that I can think of back. Intellectually, I actually did remember the hard scholarly thinking in the collegial debate as well. All the participants, bar one, I think, were tenured or had tenure-track positions at law schools, and we were looking to get feedback on draft papers that were just about to be submitted to law reviews, because those days the submission cycle was a little bit later. It was closer actually to Labor Day. All the participants had positions with American law schools, which I think we'll come back to a little bit later. Although given that Peter and I were actually part of the group, the rather odd statistic, shows you when you do statistics, is that 1/4 of the group are foreigners, but that is a rather small sample size that distorts that point. As to the goals, I actually suspect that we didn't have a single collective objective or impulse to why we all got together. Well, they're not different individuals, as Bobby and Peter articulated. Had their own aspirations, both personally and institutionally. I think looking at what IPSC has become, I think it's easy to think back with hindsight and think what we were seeing was a growing community of IP scholars that we just thought there was a need to bring them together. In fact, I think the recognition of the growth of that community, which is now vast, actually happened a few years earlier with the first standalone WLS conference in IP in San Francisco. That was the point at which I think we reached a sort of critical mass, when we recognized that we were a larger group of people who had to come together. So I think, you can sort of have a different version of what history was, I think, with hindsight. At least for my part, speaking purely personally, I took IPSC as pretty much a chance to get together with a bunch of friends, most of whom I knew professionally and pretty well personally, and get some feedback on a draft article. And if there was some grander thought that I had, it might have been in consolidating connections, mostly actually with the Chicago colleagues, because the Chicago schools at the time, all of them were trying to do more stuff in IP together on a variety of fronts. And IPSC I actually took to some extent as being part of that broader initiative. Now, why we get together now at IPSC, I think is very different. The goals obviously have evolved over the years, and the evolution started pretty early. I think Bobby and Peter are quite right. The mentoring for junior colleagues became an objective, I think, pretty early on. But I hope we actually never lose sight, no matter what the changes that happen, we never lose sight of what I saw as the 2 basic core goals that at least drove me to be involved. And that was, first of all, the advancement of ideas through scholarly exchange and the development of a scholarly community and professional relations and friendships. I think I must be the only person on this panel, maybe even this panel, or the last panel, who hasn't actually had the task of organizing and hosting particular events. So one thing I've got to do actually on behalf of all of us is to thank everyone over the years who has helped, because I know it is a tremendous job. And I think it gets harder each year, I suspect, hewing to what I think of as those two core objectives. On to change. What has changed and what to make of the changes? Well, as several people already talked about, the biggest change is pure size. We've gone from 9 to 200. In the first year, and I think this is actually true also the second year at Curto, so Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, we all stayed for the entire program. We all listened to every presentation. The first one I think was an hour each on a presentation, not 22 minutes. And we were doing so in areas, some of which we knew pretty well, and other areas we knew less so. Well, it was an ongoing collective discussion. One presentation often referencing the prior discussions, either in the presentation or in the questions. That's obviously very different from the model year's debate experience over 2 days. And I know the organizers have to grapple every year with the relative merits of sufficient time for presentations and feedback on the one hand, and being really inclusive on the other. So I don't want to sound like an ungrateful guest and moan that I would do it differently from one year to another, because I think the organizers of an event such as this are pretty much sort of in a fiduciary or custodial relationship with respect to the community, and I think they exercise those fiduciary duties very well. What I want to do instead is just offer a couple of observations on that evolution from the plenary model, not to suggest that IPSC reverts back to that model, but simply to highlight there are values embedded in that model that as a scholarly community we need to nurture, perhaps in other ways, and perhaps in other events through other institutions, because one of the other things that's happened over that 15 years is that IPSC has given rise to a whole bunch of other events. So you have WIPIP, you have works in progress events that are regionally based rather than nationally based. You have roundtables that are much smaller, and those other events might serve some of the functions that we might have thought we were doing with the first IPSC. I think it is really valuable, to get back to my point about the plenary, it's really valuable to engage with scholarship not necessarily at the core of what you do. So I think Mark is right, it's really valuable that we have enough trademark and patent people now that we actually do all engage as a discrete community. But there are increasingly very few scholars, Mark actually might be one of the few, who write in all areas of intellectual property. And I know that reflects the expansion of the field. It's impossible to keep up with everything. Right? And it may reflect to some extent the growth in the curriculum as well that Mark talks about, but I think we sacrifice something as well by becoming ever more specialist. I mean this not just within IP, I should say, but between IP and other general bodies of law. And I know you can get that mix now simply by jumping from one room to another over the next 2 days, or indeed just by going to a bunch of different conferences. So you can overstate the point. But those solutions also sacrifice something else that I think is potentially valuable, and that is non-trivial interaction with what is now a sizable group, a collective group of IP scholars, rather than just fleeting glances as you pass them from room 8005 to room 8007. I mean, I recall being at a post-IP event brunch in New York at a conference just after I started teaching, this must be almost a decade before IPSC, and remarking to my host that all the people who were at the conference had come to the brunch and they seemed to get on really well with each other and really welcoming to me as a new member of the IP community, and she said, just be glad you're doing IP and not constitutional law. And I think it's true, actually, that professional friendships that are cultivated through common experience, whether it's a crazy brunch or a karaoke or whatever, as well as the intellectual exchange, makes the inevitable intellectual disagreements that we should have, and we have to have, given our profession, makes them enjoyable rather than tense. And I think it makes new members of the profession more willing to disagree intellectually if you have that particular environment. The composition of the participants IPSC has also changed over time, and what I want to do in the rest of my remarks is really just highlight the growth along two different but potentially related dimensions. So first of all, we've seen far more folks from abroad, and we've seen a large growth in participants who are not presently in tenure-track positions. I think both of these are welcome developments, but both I think also present some challenges. So as to foreign participants, well, that might be partially explained by evolutions in the substantive field of IP, where international arena is far more significant, and we tend to be talking more often about common problems, and therefore engaging in common scholarship. It may also be, of course, that access to international scholarship is far more readily available. And what you see on this side of the Atlantic in IPSC, you can also see elsewhere. So if you look at institutions that were initially more European, or at least non-American, they now increasingly have more American involvement. So ATRIP, to pick an old example, has a lot more American involvement now, as does increasingly EPIT and ISHTIP, both of which this year are in Glasgow. And if you can forgive my plug for hometown bias, you should all take a trip to Glasgow sometime over next year to one of ISHTIP or EPIT's events. One might have hypothesized that this international engagement, this cross-fertilization of European, American, and other scholars might have caused a convergence of scholarly traditions between the more policy-driven US approach to scholarship and the more European tradition of elevating, I would say, rigorous treatment of existing case law and literature. But in fact, I think what we see, at least on the European side, is that European scholars have in fact essentially adopted many more of the critical American perspective, which I think actually has been a very good thing for European scholarship. I don't think we've seen the parallel occur in the United States, despite the international engagement. Let's just say, I don't think I've seen your American scholars that think, should we be doing more of what the Europeans are doing? And that may be because many young US scholars don't think that that type of work is professionally rewarded, but there may be a need to be a bit more of that in US scholarship, and I think it's a little bit on Mark's point as well about the politicization or ideological nature of a lot of what we do. One of the critiques that several commentators, and I think Mike Madison actually put this most eloquently a couple of years ago, have made after attending IPSC in recent years, is that a good number of people seem to be simply unaware of classic literature not too far in the past. And that's a surprise, right? And that is, they don't seem to have engaged in the in-depth excavation of the field, of the literature, that actually is a more traditional part of scholarship in Europe. And I have a sense that Mike is actually onto something, and this is a completely just my sampling size of what I read may not be particularly scientific, but I look at the number of articles that profess that they are the first person ever to have thought about a topic. Here, for untouched by any scholar in the history of mankind, it is surprisingly high, I would say. The second change, and I'll finish with this, the second change in the composition of IPC is the growth of the persons looking to get a tenure-track job rather than being in a tenure-track job. Again, I think this is a very good thing. There are far more pre-tenure type fellowships available, which should allow the development of research skills that sometimes get skipped over when, unlike Europe, the United States doesn't require new professors to have a research-based doctoral degree. And it must be a good thing also that there are many more diverse avenues to becoming a law professor. But many of the pre-tenure positions are of pretty short duration, and it appears to me, and I'd be interested in hearing what more junior scholars think of this, that there's tremendous pressure on young folks to present at IPSC, just as there is pressure to produce law review articles. I had a former colleague who complained to me, he's now retired, complained to me a few years ago that given the vast amount of information out there, you could either read or write or think, but you couldn't do more than one of those big things. I think, notwithstanding the mantra that you can learn by doing, I think we should be encouraging younger colleagues, if they wish to do so, of course, simply to attend these types of events, to listen and participate in the discussions without the need to present and write. And I think that's something deans have to think a little bit about in funding, because a lot of funding comes conditional upon presenting. I think sometimes that is harmful, and it gives you an incomplete perspective of what you're doing as a scholar. And I hope this, rather like Matt Moore's comment about the get off my lawn, I hope this is not simply a product of getting older and thinking that the world was a bit slower when I was younger. One of my first engagements when I returned to the United Kingdom, this will pick up and finish with the point that echoes what Bobby said, was to attend a fundraising exception for people who wish to give money to IP at Oxford. And our dean started to give his first set of remarks and to introduce me. He basically kind of shake down a bunch of donors. And he said that they should give money on the basis that we have the luxury to advance ideas better than others because we think slowly. And my first thought was, he's nuts. That's not going to sell. They're not going to buy that particular prescription. But in fact, the more I thought about it, the more I began to appreciate his sentiment. I think this gets to Bobby's point of authenticity. The next 2 days will be a wonderful, frenetic, frenzied blur of intense intellectualism. But I hope we can manage to find a way of allowing us to think slowly in some reliable, collegial, friendly venues such as this has been and always I hope will be, even if I doubt we can return to the model of 9 of us sitting around getting an hour to talk each about our paper around a single conference table. Thanks.
So I think because all of the panelists were good about adhering to the time limit that Josh imposed on us, we actually do have, a little bit less than 15 minutes for comments, questions, observations, and Mike, I see that your hand goes up first, so go ahead.
For anybody who wants to take it on, no one talked about publication styles, types, journal articles, book chapters, edited collections, monographs. What's changed over the same time range and strengths and weaknesses in what you observed?
I thought that was for the young people talking about an interesting kind of echo of Graeme's comment about sort of thinking fast and slow, you might think of as sort of writing short and long. I think there's a definite move towards the blog post, towards the online, short, less footnoted article. I think in many respects that is a good thing. Law review articles have traditionally been bloated largely because of the need to explain everything that has come before to second-year law students who don't know anything about it, right? And if we can bypass that, assume a base of common knowledge, and get to the interesting novel point in a much briefer way, that would be great. But I'm not sure that sort of a don't write long articles is any better than a don't write short articles as an absolute rule, right? So the new law review, nothing can be over 25,000 words, privileges certain kinds of scholarship over others, and I think most articles should be under 25,000 words and probably substantially under 25,000 words, but not all of them. And there's room, I think, for the variety of things. Once you go beyond the kind of law review, short, long, etc., I will say one thing that is maybe is a place where legal academia hasn't caught up to the rest of the world is in how we evaluate the ideas that show up in short, non-traditional forms. I think one of the people who has probably had the most impact on patent law from the legal scholarship is Dennis Crouch. But he's had it almost without exception by running a blog that sort of writes short summaries or interesting little factoid statistics that are of interest to the world, including the academic world, not by writing traditional law review articles. He's not going to get hired at a top school that way. At least today. It may be that in 2 decades that will change. I think it has a real, if you're deciding kind of how am I going to do this scholarship and you are untenured, that's a move that has substantial costs, even though it has substantial professional benefits. So we have, I think, channeled traditionally scholarship into law reviews and therefore into certain molds that come from that. We are breaking out of it in various respects, right? We've got some more peer review type journal publication opportunities. We're seeing people publishing interdisciplinarily, and those papers can take very different forms. But I think a lot of the way in which ideas are communicated in the modern world, right, through social media, through blog posts, through kind of smaller, quicker responses, are not necessarily the ways that the legal academy is willing to recognize.
Well, I want to build on Mark's comments, and I realized looking at this panel, if Peter's the baby, I think I'm the grandma on this panel, which is a little unsettling as a general matter. But I've been teaching and writing for 33 years. That's a really long time. And I think during that course, the social media revolution definitely has changed how we think and write in our daily lives. But one thing a couple points about this, when you're writing high-impact scholarship that you're writing to really make an impact in the world as opposed to in the ivory tower, even if you're going to be taking your article and spinning it into editorials that appear in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or any number of other media-driven blogs, those things have to be based on the careful groundwork that you do in your more conventional scholarship. So I see the public consumption piece of scholarship as an offshoot of, but very much grounded in what we do traditionally. And the other thing is, I want to underscore what Graeme said about how we focus on that traditional piece and the time we take, and it does go back to what Sherry Motro called that authenticity, as I interpreted her article. You got to do the groundwork. You got to take the time, and it can take a lot of time, and it's not always the most fun time when you're slogging through the work that you need to, the research and the things that come before. But lastly, when you take those traditional products and you do market them for public consumption, that can have a very real benefit for your institution. It looks good when people are featured in media and they put down, Professor XX at University XXX. That's in some ways, I think, better in terms of reputational effect than just, writing your law review articles. But it's an intertwined phenomenon. I don't think you can do one successfully, the media successfully, without the other.
I'll be very, very quick, Mike. Some of his first three pieces, I think, were all 140 pages in the good old days. And I actually missed the ability to have that amount of space to really work through something, and I think we have lost a little bit of that. Though Mark is also right that there's merit in the shorter pieces for a whole bunch of reasons as well. I think that looking at prescriptively, I think the message, I think is consistent with Mark, is that as we evaluate scholarship, we need to be more pluralist about what we think about as good scholarship, both in methods, as a place of publication. And I think we have greater capacity to do that now, and that there should be less hesitation, I think, for young scholars to be thinking about books than they would have been, let's say, 15 years ago, for two reasons. One is that you may have thought that my 340-page pieces were books, and those can't be published now, so you would actually have to go and write a book. And in fact, I think we've seen more books being published by IP scholars than we probably saw 15 years ago. But also, increasingly, and this is dependent upon evolutions in publishing, but the online availability by the major academic presses of chapters, at very least, and hopefully whole books, is making the ideas that you advance in the book capable of reaching out to more places than I think was the case 15 years ago. But from our perspective, prescriptively, I think we just need to be open to all of these different forms of getting our ideas out.
I'm amazed by how much the discussion is actually very similar to what we have in the first IPSC. So one piece of advice I got from Bobby actually is that you should not write your book until you have taught for 10 years. And at that time, I actually do not believe that that is a good piece of advice. At that time, and I thought, well, if I actually have a book, it would be easier for me to land my first tenure-track job. And most candidates already have the PhD, so they have the thesis. So they are about to publish the book. And so I signed a contract with Kwall on a book on IP in China. I still haven't published that book. They reorganized.
Yeah.
So that contract is literally gone. But now I'm actually very thankful for that piece of advice from Bobby, because the book I'll write now would be very different when I was writing just before I got my tenure-track position. So I think the takeaway is that you have to think about what type of book you want to write. If you want to write it more like a doctoral thesis, obviously they will publish before you get into a teaching position. Whereas if you actually want to have, for example, for me, the definitive book on IP in China, and now I'm in a much better position to do it than 10 years ago. And I think Graeme made a very good point. I noticed that a lot of book publishers now have site licenses where people can just easily get the chapters. So the old saying about how book chapter is going to be a waste of time, you have to do spin-off, otherwise you will not be, you cannot find it on Lexis or Westlaw. That is somewhat changing. So that might be something we can consider as well.
We have time maybe for one more question, please. Oh,
So to go back to this idea of kind of blogging and what are we doing in the blogosphere, just a couple days ago on one of the IP Cross blogs, there was some thought about what do you do when a blog like Cross blog, starts to kind of, the comment section starts to be overrun with kind of your blogging trolls. And some of this, I think, is feedback we need to take seriously. Okay, there is this question of are we providing good service to students? But some of it is, you know, ad hominem attacks and what have you. James Grimmelman suggests, you know, blog in your own private space where you can kind of control the conversation, you can handle your own moderation. But, you know, what have you seen, you know, to the extent you've been involved in blogging, what have you seen as far as what you do to have a conversation that ends up being productive instead of destructive? I guess, to the extent we want to move it.
Never, ever read comments. I wish that weren't an ironclad rule of successful living, but I'm afraid it is. If you want a discussion and not that doesn't occur in kind of structured blog post format and actually have it, then I think it has to be a small group, right, of repeat players who you know. Remember what internet and anonymity equals.